Hi everyone. It's Friday. I think I think like most of you, I've been in lockdown for what feels like an extremely long time, and that's actually a nice way into some of my research, which I'm going to talk about. My name is Michael Meeuwis. I teach in the English and Comparative Literary Studies department here at Warwick. At least I did in the before times, back when we actually went to campus. We might again, you know, maybe one day. And I wrote a book called Everyone's Theatre, Literature and Daily Life in England, 1860 to 1914. And it's a book about Victorian theatre, and Victorian theatre is the time that even theatre experts don't really know anything about. Between about Congreve and Wilde, there's a whole bunch of plays that we just don't more or less put on anymore. And that's because Victorian theatre was a little bit like Victorian television. It was extremely popular. It got to be so popular that by about the 1890s, effectively everyone was going to the theatre, everyone who could afford to go to it. But as a result of being so popular and so tied into a particular understanding of what daily life was like, they became like what sitcoms are. You know, it's the rare sitcom that lasts more than 20 or 30 years beyond the time that it was performed in. It's been weird, actually, to me that Friends has been such a thing recently. I guess some things really are, maybe timeless isn't the word, but some things do last longer than that. But if you were to watch an average evening of television in the 1980s, there'd be a whole bunch of things that we've more or less forgotten. And Victorian theatre, a little bit, was like that. But what we've lost in the kind of standing outside of their time greatness of the plays, we gain in something like social history. We gain because the Victorians put on a lot of theatre when they were bored. For me, one of the best things in the book, and one of my ways into the project, is something I wish I'd discovered, which is that when Victorian Arctic polar research stations were rediscovered, one of the things that was rediscovered with them were wigs. And, you're thinking, of course you bring a wig to a polar research station. But the reason that they did it is because they put on amateur theatricals, and of course somebody has to play the women's parts in an all-male station. And what this means is really, if you're going to the ends of the earth, every ounce of material that you bring with you has to be important. And these wigs were important enough that we were able to find them 100-odd years later. And that, to me, speaks how central putting on plays for oneself was. I did a lot of research for the book into diaries of people both in England and kind of moving around the world. And when they were moving around the world, for example, when they found themselves on a boat to India, say, people, particularly of the middle and upper middle classes, put on amateur theatricals. And what they did, and this, when you see these videos, you're watching enthusiasts talk about their hobbies in some sense, and this is still so cool to me. It's never lost that. One of the things that's really cool about Victorian theatre is, we go to famous restaurants, celebrity restaurants, Ottolenghi, say, because we want, in some sense, to buy the cookbook and, make our own slightly half-assed version of the food at home. And Victorian performers went to the theatre for exactly that reason. When they went to see a famous actor or even a non-famous actor, part of what a lot of Victorian performers were doing is that they were going to the theatre to watch things that they could reproduce at home. It's a not kind of middle-known Victorian novel, George Gissing's Diary of a Nobody. Mr. Pooter, who lives a little bit south of where I am right now in London, he lives in Holloway. Mr. Pooter has a Henry Irving impression. And so does his son, and so do his son's amateur players group. And Henry Irving was the best known Victorian actor of the later part of the 19th century. And even people who would never have had the chance to actually go and see him in the theater would have had an impression and would have heard impressions in places. The people had Henry Irving impressions in Australia, where more people than would have been the case in, say, London, would have not had the chance to go to London and see him. If you are at all familiar with the phenomenon of, say, Al Pacino impressions, imagine that, but where nobody actually got to see Al Pacino's films. Because, of course, one of the neat things about Victorian theater in terms of the history of media is that it is a mass medium. Theater becomes such a big industry that it travels all the way around the world in all sorts of really neat ways. There are sometimes theater set designs are sent by coded telegram message so that they can't be stolen or intercepted. There was industrial espionage and things like that. But one of the things that's really neat about it is that people were trying to put on the same thing around the world. They were trying to realize a mass medium in their homes using their bodies and their memories and what information they could find. And that information was often scripts and visual information, and those you can mail around the world. They travel a lot more easily than do bodies. And their own memories or the memories of people like them or people who were in their communities of what going to the theater was like. And I read a whole bunch of guides to Victorian amateur performance, and one of the things that they say, and I think this is kind of lovely, particularly if there are any parents watching this, is that they encourage you to think about your kids, and they say, well, think about the temperaments of everyone in your household, and then slot them into a theatrical representation, and it'll be good for them. The manuals claim that it's healthful for the kids, gives them something to do, but it also puts these personalities into an arrangement where some good can come of them. So you don't just have a surly teenager, but you've got a phlegmatic theatrical type ready to play Prince Hamlet or whatever Victorian B-grade version of Prince Hamlet your amateur company wanted to put on. And we've all been cooped up in the house recently. I don't know if you've noticed that. But one of the things that you might have been noticing in your own household, or even just me watching this video, is that we all have really distinctive and, at least in my case, really annoying personal tics and habits. And of course, the great thing about theatricals, at least as they advertise themselves, is that it was a chance to put all of the sets of tics in your household, all of the personalities of your family members into some sort of arrangement. And you could actually, there were so many scripts available, you could actually go and find a script for, they didn't use this language, but, if you had two surly daughters, one overly athletic son, and maybe a heavy-set father, you could find a script that would make use of all of them. And one of the things that I think we've lost in our memory of the Victorian period is that, of course, for them, all of these Victorian houses that make up still so much of the geography, the urban geography of this country, a lot of those were new for the Victorians. And one of the big stories of the 19th century was being the first family into decent private accommodation. And so for all of these people living in what were then new houses, you kind of didn't know what to do with yourself. You needed things to do to entertain yourself and your family members. You didn't have to be on an Arctic research expedition to be stuck with a bunch of kids and a spouse and evenings on your hands. And that's what theatricals allowed people to do. They allowed people to do something with their time, and we do exactly the same thing now. You in your own household, like mine in mine, I think that's how that sentence would work. You in your household might have been watching theater recently. That is to say, you might have been watching the NT live streams or one of the other theaters, maybe that's on iPlayer or something like that. Shout out to Barrel Organ. Victorian English students and some of their plays are available online. You might have been doing that to fill some of the time. There was a New York Times article talking about how people are once again reading novels out loud to one another, and I suspect that there are some families who have been putting on plays with one another, although that's a little bit harder to imagine in our own time, at least for some of us. But we do all sorts of other things together when we get together. I know that video quizzes are enormously popular. Equally, participatory video games give everyone a chance to, get together and kind of perform things. I don't know if you guys were around for the Rock Band thing a few years ago when everyone had kind of, fake musical instruments that you got to play like they were real musical instruments, got to make a representation of, actual rock performances. These are all echoes of things that Victorian families did, obviously, without the internet, without a lot of the electrical technologies, without electricity, indeed, until well late into the century. But they really put their backs into it. Victorian amateur performers would put on plays all throughout their lives. I've got diaries of people who would spend, military careers in India, and as they went up and down the continent, they would have a type or two, a stage Scotsman or something like that, and everywhere they were, they would slot themselves into a performing arrangement where a stage Scotsman was needed, and these persona really followed people around the world. So it mattered to them. I think it's actually kind of wonderful, something kind of wonderful in thinking about, we think a lot about timeless literature, but there's also entirely time-bound literature. A lot of the things that we'll be doing with our daily lives are probably going to be lost to history, or someone 100 years from now is going to be recovering, fighting games or shared Red Dead Redemption 2 playthroughs or something like that. They'll be recovering the things that we did to keep ourselves busy while we found ourselves confined in these newly enclosing, maybe newly a bit estranged spaces of our own homes. Thank you so much for listening.